Hello, everybody, and welcome back to your weekly news recap. We are your hosts, Jacob Smith.
And Matt Morgans.
To get you up to speed on last week in gaming, so you can go into this week refreshed and ready to go. And let's just jump right into it with some interesting news regarding Nintendo and some rumors that have surfaced about the Switch. And as some of you may know, as some of you may not, Nintendo has recently released a Switch with an increased battery life, much to the dismay of people who may have purchased it fairly recently, such as myself. But personal grudges notwithstanding, some rumors circulated. People were saying that Nintendo is actually offering to fully refund your console if you had purchased it after the date of July 17th. But Nintendo has come to swiftly denounce those pretty obvious rumors. That seems pretty much too good to be true, right?
Yeah, 100% too good to be true.
And I think
that's definitely what's the word? People, wishing something that was never going to happen.
Absolute wishful thinking. I think people really wanted to bought into it because they wanted to buy into it. I saw the news. I was like, all right, I'm gonna give it a day. I'm gonna give it a day before I get excited because I'm gonna set myself up to be sad. But I think this also was an easy one for people to kind of drum up because Nintendo very quietly internally confirmed that they will be issuing free refunds for anyone experiencing Joy-Con drift, which was an issue that really rose to prominence in the last few weeks. They have since made good on that promise. Several people have reported that they indeed got their Joy-Cons replaced. No one asked for a warranty. No one asked any questions. It was simply replaced, which is, of course, awesome to see.
Yeah, that is very good.
So I think people were really hoping that Nintendo would extend that goodwill just a little bit more.
Yes, I can see them extending the goodwill when it comes to replacing something that is demonstrably broken, especially because they could potentially be in legal trouble if they didn't do anything about it, because they might get into trouble for selling a product that is seemingly faulty.
Yes. Well, they were facing a class action up until, they had quietly kind of rearranged how they do things and how they issue repairs.
I mean, I've no doubt that if it had ever gone to a lawsuit, it probably would have dragged on for years, as these things do tend to. But, it would have probably saved them money in the long run doing this rather than going into a lawsuit, which, as I say, would have dragged on with expensive corporate legal fees and probably ended up in them having to do this anyway.
One thing, they probably saw that, right? And they saw that they can not only save time, money, they can save face in front of the public really garner the goodwill of their customers, which they've done. I mean, granted, this is what they should have done, and they made good on it. So,
but obviously it's a very different thing than just out of the goodness of their hearts replacing everybody's Switches with the new Switch, which no like, even Nintendo is not going to do that.
Yes, I just sucked it up, accepted it wasn't going to happen, and bought my my Anchor power brick so I could play on the go longer. And to anyone who bought before the update, that's exactly what you should do too. Or you get your little Switch Lite when it comes out this September. Who knows? Whatever you prefer. But Matt, tell me something about what I've been hearing regarding Apex Legends and some major backlash from the community.
Oh boy. Yes, Respawn has not been popular with its community in the last week, and this all kind of circulates around their new Iron Crown Collection event. So this, if you're wondering what this event is, you are not alone, because they released almost nothing about what this event actually was until the day of launch for this event. They
always smart.
They said that it was going to include a limited time run of a solos mode for Apex Legends, which was received with, I think, mixed responses from fans. But as it turns out, that's really just one part of this event, and pretty much everything else they said nothing about until they launched the event. and that proved to be a pretty significant mistake. Because there was immediate backlash about some of the ways that this event had been set up. And really, it's not in terms of what was added to the game, it's in terms of the monetization that this event introduces. Because this event basically spans a series of different updates to the game. So you've got the solos mode, which seems to be something of a limited time test to see what players make of it. They're doing a map update that's going to last for a while. And the other thing is they're introducing a whole load of new cosmetics and a new sort of event-based cosmetic loot system. Problem is, they made all of the cosmetics only available through Apex packs, which, as players noticed immediately, violates the pledge that they originally made to the community that they would never do that.
Oh no.
Yes,
oh, no.
And as you can imagine, that went incredibly poorly for Respawn.
I'm shocked.
Certainly
really.
a bad week to be working on Respawn's social media team.
Yeah. Twitter's not been nice.
And as a result, the studio had to release this official statement on the website where they kind of formally apologized for both the specific issues in the new collection event, but also their poor communication in general, because this really seems like something that would have been spotted by fans well before launch if they had actually released information about this ahead of time. And it was a bit weird that they didn't release any information.
It does feel weird.
I don't think it was malicious. Like, I don't think Respawn was trying to sneak this in. I honestly think they just misunderstood how fans were going to react. And I think they were trying probably to stoke hype and were a bit overconfident in what they were delivering. Because this is not like anything they've done before. This is a very different style of event to anything they've run previously. And Respawn's Drew McCoy did say, he said, "We need to be better at letting our players know what to expect from the various event structures in Apex Legends." And he said later their messaging for expectations needs to be clearer, and basically said that this is kind of like a learning experience for Respawn, and sometimes they get it wrong, and in this case they did. So it sounds like they're taking this to heart, and as evidence to that, they are going to be introducing some changes on the 20th, which maybe slightly prior to when this comes out, but those changes will go into place, and essentially all the stuff will still be available as it's currently available, but they'll be introducing another way for people to get the different cosmetics through a rotating store system that seems like it addresses at least most of the problems. It doesn't completely address the issues, but I don't think they could completely address them without kind of scrapping the event. So I think it's the best that they can do at short notice. And the public apology is a good sign. They very easily could have just ignored this. It wouldn't have gone well, but they could have done, and we've certainly seen studios do that in the past. So hopefully this was just a misstep, and in a month or so's time it will have blown over, and they'll be on another event that does things a bit differently.
Yeah, this is interesting because, like you said, it really isn't something that Respawn has done before, and I'm wondering, right? Obviously, we'll never know but I'm wondering if gating certain content off is a result of pressure from EA. And I'm not saying that the implementation of this in the game is EA's fault, right? That how they do it in game is obviously left up to Respawn, and how they present it to fans is obviously left up to Respawn in probably most of its entirety. But I think EA might be seeing, the decline, the pretty tangible decline in player base, in player hours from when the game launched. They might be looking to incentivize people to kind of make more purchases.
Yeah.
And to me, again, the rollout and I think the way they've handled this publicly is on Respawn, and the way they've handled it publicly has been great on Respawn's part. But underneath the surface, this kind of feels like there might have been some corporate pressure. Am I wrong in thinking that?
I don't think there's. We've obviously not got enough evidence to say that this was EA leaning on
Certainly.
them. I think it's possible.
Yeah.
I don't want to go into kind of conspiracy theory territory.
Of course not.
And in general, I think Respawn has generally been fairly independent of EA with the way that they've handled Apex. I do agree with you that it's definitely possible that EA could be leaning on them a bit more now that the numbers have dropped, because their launch of Season 2 hasn't really done a lot to boost numbers. It's still a game that is drawing a decent number of players. Obviously, when you compare it to some of the big heavy hitters like Fortnite, it's obviously not in that league anymore.
Yeah.
But, in its own slightly lower league, it's definitely still drawing in numbers.
It isn't just dying, not at all.
Yeah, it's in no risk of dying completely. But it's definitely not hitting the numbers that it got at launch, which, I mean, there's numerous reasons why it can't get back to that, and why that was a bit of a fluke in and of itself. But I think we've discussed that in previous episodes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, it's possible that EA is leaning on them. It's also possible that this was just a misstep from their monetization team, or whoever handles this in Respawn. It's worth remembering that that the way that players experience games and the way that developers experience games can be different.
Yes.
And if there's not good communication going on between the fans who are putting hours and hours of gameplay in and the devs who are, maybe spending more time in testing areas and, working on those kinds of things rather than just sitting down and playing the game, they're not necessarily going to deliver what people want. And that's definitely an issue that often happens with development teams, that their view of the game and their view of what players want is not necessarily what the core audience wants, because the core audience is going back and playing this game for hours on end. And that's a very different experience if you're working on it. So hopefully Respawn will learn from EA and honestly from DICE about communication, because a lot of these kind of communication issues were things that DICE was dealing with 4 or 5 months ago and before that. DICE had a lot of issues with communication with fans. They seem to have mostly rectified that now, and they do have a very active social media presence, especially on Reddit. But obviously there's also not as much media scrutiny around the game, because it's well past launch, and the game's core fan base is mostly the people who are playing just constantly, and most of the casual people have moved on to other things. So communication's a little easier in that regard. But hopefully DICE can pass things on within the internal EA space. Certainly I know that they've supported one another in the past, so hopefully this is an area where lessons could be passed on.
Yeah, we know. I mean, we know that EA actively encourages developers to learn, developer teams to learn from one another, as is evidenced by BioWare learning from DICE on how to use the Frostbite engine when it came to working through Dragon Age. And so we've seen things like this. We heard a statement from the man whose name I cannot recall right now, but basically defending EA by saying its smaller publishers or smaller devs, their indie teams, are able to kind of help inform their bigger development teams, which kind of, this is not an instance where I think that would be applicable, but it's another instance of EA saying, we have a lot of development teams at our disposal. They should be at everyone else's disposal as well within the company.
You would hope that EA's role as a publisher would help to facilitate dialogue between their various studios.
Certainly, and it seems to be the case from the outside looking in, and like you said, hopefully Respawn can really bounce back from this, because I know that we all know that they kind of have gamers' best interests at heart, judging by their past releases and how transparent they've been going forward, or going back, in their history. So I think going forward we can see a lot of that more from them. But in other news, we've got personally some pretty exciting stuff from THQ Nordic. THQ Nordic has been just tugging at my heartstrings, because they announced a couple months back that they're re-releasing SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom, rebooting or remastering that. Yes, straight from my childhood. Thank you very much. Destroy All Humans is coming from THQ Nordic. They swept up the Kingdoms of Amalur IP and haven't said anything about that. Like, they are able to... They're in a unique position in the industry where their role has been, for the last 5 years, in prominence, to pick up all these little bits and pieces of old IP and create awesome things. And it looks like...
Am I right in thinking that THQ Nordic was the studio or publisher that announced earlier this year that they had something like 60 games in development?
80 games.
80
yes,
games.
You're absolutely right.
Yes, I thought so.
And it's things like that. Like, they quietly have a bunch of studios working on reviving these IP, and that's primarily what I mean. They did that for Darksiders. They released Darksiders 3, like,
absolutely
taking franchises that players thought were dead and giving them a second life. And they are doing that with a couple franchises and giving life to a franchise that already has some left in it. In an earnings call, they pretty much announced that, yes, a new Saints Row game is deep in development. By their own words, it's deep in development. That is the first in a series of 3 games that they kind of touched on. My question with that is, do you, Matt, do you think that they're going to go back to the Saints Row 3, where they're kind of... The game was still focused, but very off the rails goofy, or do you think they're going to keep going in that Saints Row 4 and Get Out of Hell, like superpowers, absolutely over the top anime action that they've got going on?
It's honestly hard to tell. I feel like they would do better toning it down a little bit, just because you can't just keep one-upping things, especially when you've one-upped them so absurdly in the existing Saints Row games. Like, there's only so far you can go before it just starts to be sort of over the top for its own sake.
Yes.
And not really necessarily good for the gameplay or the story.
Not conducive to a great game. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Honestly, I'd be happy to see them almost doing like a reboot, and kind of just not going all the way back, because obviously the original Saints Row was almost closer to GTA than the later Saints Rows.
Yeah, GTA clone is an easy comparison to making the early games, for sure.
Yeah, but Saints Row 3 might be a good point for them to kind of base on. But we'll see. Maybe they've got some absurd plan. Maybe we're going to see Saints Row 500 years in the future and some kind of space empire. Because who knows with Saints Row?
Can, right? Yeah, no. With Saints Row, 3 was absolutely the peak of the franchise. I think if they returned to that, at least that wittiness and that smart writing and that excellent voice acting, like the strong characters, that is at its core what made Saints Row good. The silliness comes naturally, so I think I hope that is the next step for the franchise, because I think that's what everyone else is feeling as well. We also got news that a new Timesplitters is coming, which has excited a lot of people. Kind of confused, or maybe some people maybe caused them to question a lot of things. I know I've got a lot of questions personally, but something that's pretty encouraging is that co-creator of the franchise, Steve Ellis, is on as an advisory role to the game. At least as far as we know, it's an advisory role. He could be very, very hands-on with the development of this game. Steve Ellis is also one of the guys who primarily developed the GoldenEye N64 multiplayer, so he's got a lot of roots in old school gaming, and gaming that is near and dear to everyone's hearts, as well as kind of newer shooter marvels like Crysis 2, which was as we were discussing pre-episode, a severely underrated game.
Oh, for sure. Fantastic game.
What do you think about the future of Timesplitters, Matt? Where do you think it's headed? Where do you hope it's headed?
It's very difficult to say. It's one of those series that's kind of been out of the game so long, for all intents and purposes, that it's honestly difficult to know what a modern Timesplitters would look like. Because I don't think if they just went back to what the last Timesplitters looked like and brought that to modern consoles, I don't think it would hold up. I think the industry has kind of moved on, especially when it comes to shooter mechanics. And the last Timesplitters was not a recent game in the slightest. And I think just, aesthetically, and also when it comes to the story and the core gameplay, lots of things have changed. And I think they are going to have to move with the times. They can't just rely on the old aesthetic and the old franchise name to carry it to success.
Certainly.
I'd really like to see them do something like what Bethesda has done with Doom and Wolfenstein and games like that. Taking a really old, very one-dimensional first-person shooter and giving it like a totally big rework, staying true to that original aesthetic, but just modernizing it and giving it a lot more than just a fresh coat of paint.
Absolutely.
A full new gameplay mechanics, a much better story, and kind of a refreshing take on the settings. I think that'd be the perfect way to bring back Timesplitters.
Totally. I mean, I think old IP from back in the 90s, early 2000s can go one of two ways. We can go Doom and Wolfenstein, or can go Duke Nukem. In the sense that I don't think this would be necessarily the catastrophe that Duke Nukem Forever was, but in the sense that Duke Nukem Forever was not modernized. It was not brought up with the times. It ran on the 360. Exactly. It had modernized mechanics, but it as a game was not brought up to modern standards, whereas Doom and Wolfenstein are perfect examples of games that have gone above and beyond as far as bringing those games into the forefront of what games are at their core today. And bringing back that same fast-paced, awesome action shooter that we love, and just amping it up and making it a new experience as well as something that's familiar. It's a hard balance to strike, and I hope Timesplitters can really get there. And one last thing that we don't really have to touch on, because I don't feel like, personally, I'm not that big a fan anymore, at least, but Dead Island 2 is still a thing. I know it's like, oh, cool announcement, interesting announcement, and Dead Island 2. But Dambuster Studios are the new devs. It's been handed off from countless studios now. I think like 3. This might be 3 or 4. And the game was originally slated for a 2015 release. The game came out. The first one came out 9 years ago, and not to bring up Duke Nukem Forever, but. Are we that far off at this point?
I think the people working on it need to really start really asking the question of, is this a game that needs a sequel? And is it a game that needs a sequel after 9 years? Because I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, but the first Dead Island had a trailer that got everyone hyped for a very mediocre game.
Oh, absolutely. It was a brilliant, wonderfully put together cinematic trailer. It was awesome. It was played in reverse. Yeah. Super artistic. The music, the atmosphere was great, and the game was a solid 5.5. Like, it was nothing. It was nothing right on about.
I wonder if there are, if the publishers who are trying to push for a second game are mistaking high sales because of that kind of misleading trailer for the game having popularity.
Yeah, they had the spin-off Dead Island Riptide, which sold okay, I guess well enough to warrant a full-fledged sequel.
Yeah.
But we'll see. Honestly, I don't have high hopes for Dead Island 2. I enjoyed
No.
Dead Island 1 because I was, granted, younger and I had a bunch of friends to play it with, and it was like, that was the appeal. But I don't think, unless they can do something really phenomenal, like the original creators of Dead Island went on to make Dying Light. Like, Dying Light is a phenomenal game.
Yeah,
And the sequel
for
is set up to be something awesome, but it's because they did something so different from what they did before, that I think Dying Light 2 would need to take a severe turn, a left turn into a town it is not even venturing toward right now to warrant its release, and all the time spent on it. But we'll see. I mean,
it's been passed off to a smaller studio now, hasn't it? So
yes,
maybe a smaller development team can take it and do something a bit more original with it. Maybe at the end of the day, Dead Island 2 just ends up basically sharing the same name, but the gameplay could be entirely different. If they cotton on to the fact that people probably don't care about a Dead Island 2 that's really true to the original, then maybe they can come up with something a bit more original, especially if the publisher gives them more leeway. But honestly, we don't know. And at this point, I think there's not even a guarantee that this game ever sees release.
No.
It's been passed around too many times.
This is the literal definition of development hell.
For sure.
So I think we should kind of round out the week with, unfortunately, some more disheartening news. I know, I'm sorry, guys, I'm such a buzzkill. But we got an interview from Yves Guillemot, who is the CEO of Ubisoft, or Ubisoft, depending on how y'all pronounce it, on the new Splinter Cell. Do not get excited yet. We got news that they are indeed working on another Splinter Cell title, but that it, and I quote, won't be a traditional release. Guillermo said in the interview that they're looking to bring Splinter Cell to new platforms, which, I mean, not a traditional release. New platforms. This screams mobile title. I don't see any other avenue. Matt, please. Dissuage my worries.
New platforms, and this is a very optimistic statement that I don't really fully believe myself, but new platforms could just mean the next generation of consoles.
Oh, Matt, we talked about wishful thinking in the beginning of the episode, and I think we're really...
Yeah. I mean, it's possible.
Because
it's possible that that there might be some sort of mobile tie-in or something like that. We have seen that from Ubisoft in the past with them doing mobile tie-ins aligning with games that they release on console.
They certainly tried it, yeah.
And maybe that's something that they're looking to do again. I can't imagine that they think that a mobile release of Splinter Cell is going to be popular.
Oh my god, no, they can't. I mean, this just screams bad idea.
Yeah, I feel like Ubisoft is generally pretty well aware of what their fans want, especially with some of their more recent endeavours. And I would point to Assassin's Creed particularly as a case where they arguably were not hugely in tune with what people wanted for a while, but more recently definitely have been, and have really delivered what the fans wanted in most cases. I would be very surprised if they turned around and said the next Splinter Cell's going to be a mobile title.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe we see a mobile re-release of some of the old Splinter Cells.
Oh my gosh.
Or like a remastering of the old Splinter Cells on mobile.
At this point,
I could see that.
I'm just hoping it's like a Switch exclusive and that's it. Like that's the wildest thing.
Yeah.
Because, okay, here's my thing. Best case scenario, right? Won't be a traditional release and bringing it to new platforms. Best case scenario, they're trying to go episodic like Hitman did. That's how the success
I would love that.
Which would be awesome, and new platforms indeed means next generation. That's best case scenario. Worst case scenario, They Command and Conquer bastardized this thing, and absolutely,
Yeah.
I mean, it is mobile exclusive, or it's like a Splinter Cell Go, something.
That's
simple.
interesting that you say Hitman, because that was absolutely my first thought when I read that he said it won't be a traditional release. My first thought was Hitman, not Hitman 2, but the one before.
Yes.
Which released episodic.
And did well. And
missions.
did well. Was well reviewed.
Yeah,
and
did very well for a game that had a relatively small budget because of the fact that they had to release it in this episodic format. They actually didn't do that with Hitman 2 because they had a much bigger budget.
Yeah.
And yeah, this honestly might be a way for them to, maybe they looked at Hitman and thought, we're honestly not sure if the next Splinter Cell can fit into our model of kind of open world games that we're doing at the moment. And we've discussed that in I think when we were when E3 was going on, we discussed potential Splinter Cell news and kind of pointed out the fact that Ubisoft is really focusing on larger open world titles right now, and Splinter Cell doesn't necessarily fit that mold. So, maybe taking on an episodic format would be a way for them to undertake another Hitman project another Splinter Cell project without giving it a huge budget, and trying to bring it into a format that doesn't necessarily work.
All right, final proposition. Death Stranding is released. Ubisoft contracts Kojima Productions to do an open world Splinter Cell in the vein of MGS5. We're going way out of left field, Matt, but I'm telling you, this is the only way that this news can be good. And that is going to do it for us this week. Thank you so much for tuning in. You can find all these stories and more, of course, at VGR.com. If you've got any feedback or just want us to cover any topics, please let us know in the comments down below. As usual, I have been your host, Jacob Smith.
And I'm Matt Morgans.
And we will see you next week.